first question I want to ask you is, you began by talking about arriving at the solution of a particular problem requires an understanding, sort of a shared understanding of the genesis of the problem. You mentioned this up there. You talked a little bit about the right-left alignment, but you didn't go into great depth about it. It's a matter of some curiosity. There's this notion of the right and left coming together on criminal justice is like man bites dog. And a lot of folks are paying attention to it. You are obviously in the belly of the beast, and you've been spending a lot of time on this task force against over-criminalization. So talk to us a little bit, do you and your colleagues, your conservative colleagues, share an understanding of the genesis of the problem that we're confronting?
It's a great question, and when I got to Congress, I, of course, as I mentioned, was appointed to the Judiciary Committee, and then in May, I got the opportunity, through the recommendation of Bobby Scott, who was then the lead Democrat on the crime subcommittee, to be appointed to a task force on over-criminalization. 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, evenly divided, progressives, conservatives, people from red states and blue states. And at first, I thought it was an interesting endeavor. I was intellectually curious. I wasn't sure if it was going to go anywhere. But then as I looked deeper into the situation and how we had gotten to a point where the House Judiciary Committee was willing to explore this dynamic of over-criminalization, I realized a few things. One, Nick, that was important is that a lot of criminal justice reform work had already been done at the state level. And I was privileged to be involved with the leadership of Jeff Aubrey here in New York when the Rockefeller drug laws, of course, were eradicated, thankfully. But when you look across the span of the United States of America in the aftermath of 2008, there were many states in the Deep South, Georgia, South Carolina, Kentucky, Alabama's done some work, Texas, that engaged in different degrees of pretty significant efforts to reduce their incarcerated population. And this was all led by Republican governors, and in most instances, with Republican state legislative bodies with clear majorities in both houses. And some of it may have been driven by the need to deal with the collapse of the economy in this country, and budgets across the United States were devastated, and it was clear that this incarceration model could no longer be sustained. And I think that when you look at each and every one of those states, the experience has been in Texas, in South Carolina, in Georgia, and in Kentucky, that every one of those states since 2008, where they've engaged in prison reform, cut their incarcerated population, they've all experienced at least 20% reductions in violent crime. And so, for us to come to a moment in the Capitol has to be understood in the context of work that has taken place at the state level, which empirically should give everyone some measure of confidence that we're moving in the right direction, both from the standpoint of fiscal reasonableness. It's the right thing to do in the democratic republic known as the United States of America, in terms of notions of fairness and equality and justice. But beyond that, it has shown, or at least be correlated with, an enhancement in public safety, not a decline in public safety. And so I think foundationally, there's a lot of support for the notion that this is not a New York thing, or a California thing, or just a blue state thing. It's a blue state thing. It's a red state thing. It really is a red, white, and blue American thing in terms of the need for criminal justice reform. And so there really is a solid foundation upon which to act.
So another one of these red, white, and blue things that you've talked about is the power of money. So you made reference to the military-industrial complex, creating an analogy with the prison-industrial complex. You talked about the 1994 crime bill and the incentives that the federal government provided to states to build prisons. You've spent a bunch of time here in New York, and you know well what the what the dynamics are with the Senate and their protection of what are economic engines in regions that otherwise don't have much in the way of economic engines. So what do you think of this idea? Is it plausible to just acknowledge that in any other context, whether it's international trade agreements or reducing our use of coal or other industries that are shrinking, what the federal government often does is provide adjustment assistance to jurisdictions, to areas where industries are going to contract. Sometimes it's training for people who are in that industry. Sometimes it's economic development, but we're seeing it right now in the climate context. And sort of putting moral rightness or wrongness aside and recognizing where you work and how much money drives the conversation. Plausible for the federal government to say, look, the only way to shrink the prison industrial complex is to create ways for places that rely upon prisons to figure out how to drive their economies in a different way, and we're going to help them do that.
Well, I think that certainly is something that would help secure or support in areas of the country where there will be great resistance given the reliance on prisons in far too many parts of America. And that was something that was done here in New York. We've been able to dramatically close both prisons in New York, as well as with the leadership of the governor and as here, deal with juvenile justice and reducing the reliance on facilities that were far away from families of the children who are housed in these facilities and move things in a better direction. But in doing so, in closing the prisons and closing the juvenile detention centers, some measure of assistance provided to these communities to try to readjust in a way that is more economically appropriate. Now, what's interesting in Congress is that part of the debate and part of the appeal for many of the fiscal conservatives who are part of this discussion is that some of the money that is used from a reduction in the incarceration dynamic in America be redirected to reducing our deficit and dealing with our exploding federal debt. And as we sort of move forward in a broader way with this discussion, I think there's an acknowledgement amongst many of us on the Democratic side that we're going to have to arrive at an accommodation that uses some part of the savings to deal with our fiscal situation from the debt or deficit perspective. That's what conservatives fiscally will demand. But also to use a significant part of the savings from the incarceration model to reinvest in communities, like many of the communities of color that I represent in Brooklyn, many inner city communities all across the country, in ways that will create a more robust pathway for young people in this country to pursue the American dream. Frederick Douglass once said to us that it's easier to build strong children than it is to repair broken men. And I think philosophically, if we can invest in building stronger children throughout this country, we'll be much better off.
Thank you. We're going to turn to the audience. Do we have a microphone that we need to use? Yeah, yes, please. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll get you a mic.
Congressman, I have a question about reactive policy. So when there's something that happens in the news that's maybe sensationalized that people are frightened of, how do we push against reactive policy that it comes down the pike from certain things that take place and kind of stay the course when when the suggestions that are being put forth are not good criminal justice policy?
Yeah, it's a great question, and that is one of the reasons why we're in the situation that we confront right now. Because criminal justice policy has far too often been driven by a reaction to a sensational yet isolated event. Now, a lot of it was fueled by the explosion of the crack cocaine epidemic in the inner city and the violence associated with that. I don't want to overstate the point or get in the minds of those who were public policy makers back in 1986 or 1994, but we also know that the death of Len Bias, who was a prominent basketball player from the University of Maryland, All-American, expected to be at the level perhaps of a Michael Jordan or a LeBron James. Let me throw Carmelo Anthony in there. And it's on tape. But died of a cocaine overdose. And when you talk to people who were in the House or the Senate back in 1986, they'll tell you that part of the reason we got such harsh laws was in response to that particular sensational death. And it was a reaction to it that helped to usher in part, the era of mass incarceration. Now, one of the reasons why I pose this question as to whether we do everything possible to move criminal justice reform forward in this climate, even if we can't get to the Safe Justice Act level, is because the tendency, I think, still exists naturally for elected officials to react to an incident that outrages individuals in their community. And we're always confronted with that risk. And we don't know if the public mood will change in response to an incident that rightfully draws outrage. And then, as elected officials, people are compelled to react to that incident and walk away from the criminal justice reform that is on the table. And so, it's something that we're going to have to grapple with. But the manner in which criminal justice policy has been done clearly in reaction to sensational incidents to appear tough on crime is incredibly problematic. And no one can say with any degree of confidence that we are beyond that point in time, even in an era where crime has continued to go down dramatically.
Thank you so much for your comments. That was great. I had a question about something I thought was missing from the bills that you talked about, which is just changing the way we even think about what prisons and jails are supposed to do. It seems like the idea would be towards restoration and restitution. We had a chance to visit some German examples where people, corrections officers, thought of themselves as counselors and coaches, right? Which is a fundamentally different model than like, I'm your guard and I'm here to make sure you don't do anything bad. In fact, I'm here to make sure you don't do anything. Like you just sit here for years with nothing productive to do. How do you change the whole, and then the jails are, it's like a wild, wild west, right? Like we don't have a language with which to say, this is what they're actually supposed to be moving towards. So if you're lucky to have a progressive board, then that's cool. And, or in somebody who can institute good management, that's great. But otherwise, you know, we just don't have that language anywhere around what is it that jails and prisons are supposed to be doing. How do we measure how well they do it?
Yeah, no, it's a very important question, and I think, so there's a bill that Jason Chaffetz, who's a Republican from Salt Lake City, Utah, and I introduced as original co-sponsors. He's the lead sponsor. It's a simple bill, but it would just change the name of the Bureau of Prisons at the federal level to the Department of Corrections. And it was designed as a jump start very early on in this conversation during the last Congress to begin to even have a conversation about what the correctional system should be designed to do. When I was in law school, my good friend Eddie Rodriguez, in criminal law, you would hear about 4 different, and maybe Nick, you remember this from law school, but incapacitation, deterrence, retribution, and rehabilitation. And really what we've seen over the last several decades, is a focus on retribution, focus on incapacitation, perhaps a theory of deterrence. We've abandoned rehabilitation as a core tenet of the criminal justice system. Now, one of the things that is promising about this right-left coalition that has emerged, there are really 3 elements of the Republican Party that have begun to theoretically get behind prison reform. This is one of the reasons why I'm cautiously optimistic that something can happen. We talked about the fiscal conservatives, who have increasingly, of course, come to the conclusion that mass incarceration is a wasteful government program, doesn't produce results, and hurts our economic productivity and the development of human capital. And so from a fiscal conservative standpoint, prison reform, we can argue, makes sense to that slice of the Republican Party. Then you've got Tea Party libertarians, Raul Labrador, who's emerged as a good friend. He's on the other side of a whole lot of issues from me. But on prison reform, as a Tea Party libertarian, and this is the libertarian philosophy, they don't believe in overtaxation, they don't believe in overregulation, increasingly they don't believe in overcriminalization, and they think that all 3 are examples of government overreach. And we can argue to them that overcriminalization should be an area of grave concern to a libertarian, because when the government can take away your life or your liberty, if they overreach in that area, it's fundamentally inconsistent with who we are as a democratic republic. But then the 3rd group, to your point about how we think about what is done within the correctional system and beyond in terms of transition, who have gotten beyond, or gotten behind, I should say, prison reform in the emerging conservative Republican coalition, are the Christian conservatives, who theologically believe in redemption as a core tenet of their religious philosophy, and therefore have shown leadership. And there's a group I know Nick is very familiar with, Right on Crime, and others, who supported, for instance, George Bush's effort around the Second Chance Act, and who believe that once someone has paid their debt to society, it should be given every opportunity to start anew, to successfully reintegrate into society, and that we should be doing things to prepare them for that while they're on the inside. And so I think there's going to be opportunity to go beyond sentencing reform and to fundamentally try to transform the nature of our correctional facilities at the federal and at the state level, even in the area of reentry, and sustain this coalition, because there are elements that are part of it on the right whose main involvement in this effort is to promote sort of the redemptive opportunity of being given a second chance.
I think we have time for one last question, and then we'll break.
Great remarks and a great conversation. It seems to me the country is, a large section of the country now is gripped in feelings of vulnerability. That, the future isn't as bright as they once felt it would be for themselves or for their children. So one of the things that I'm concerned about in terms of what we're talking about in terms of rehabilitation is post-secondary education programs in prisons to try and reduce recidivism. When the country's doing that, I can't afford to send my own child to college. How do you combat that with all of the various constituencies coming together in terms of effective policy and programmatic changes in terms of the, converting the Federal Bureau of, to corrections.
Yeah, no, it's an important observation, and the American people are generally feeling under siege, and you've seen a variety of different political movements rise up in response to that. One could argue that the Tea Party movement has risen up, sort of, I would argue, as a misplaced, misappropriated response to the anger that was created in the aftermath of the collapse of the economy in 2008, but nonetheless a response. And even, of course, the emergence of Bernie Sanders, who has really articulated an economic agenda anchored in frustration that is reasonably felt by people who are working class Americans, hardworking Americans, middle class folks, younger Americans, who increasingly have been left behind. That is a climate that we're living in right now, and it's anchored in facts. You can just kind of trace that same period that I referenced, although this is probably coincidental, but that same period that I referenced in the early 1970s, the productivity of the American worker has increased to the present day in excess of 275%. That's the productivity of the American worker. The wages of the American worker at that same time period has increased less than 10%. 275% increase in productivity, less than 10% gain in wages. Wages have largely remained stagnant. It's empirically accurate to observe that the gains as a result of American workers doing their job in a far more efficient fashion have not endured to the benefit of the great American middle class working families and others. And so there's a great deal of economic frustration. And it becomes harder in that climate to deal with some of the more proactive things in the incarceration context that would make sense in terms of post-secondary education, in terms of providing people with the skills and the technical ability. We're going to continue to push for it. It is the right thing to do. We will always hear from some who would argue that individuals who've made a mistake should not be put at the front of the line in terms of economic opportunity. In some ways, it's an understandable but misguided perspective. We've got to increase the pie for everyone. And I'll close by making an observation. I was at a meeting earlier this year at the White House that President Obama had convened with Democrats and Republicans, senators and House members. Probably about 15 or 16 of us. Vice President was there. And John Conyers was there from the House, and Chairman Goodlatte was there, Mike Lee, Cory Booker. To kind of give you a sense of the type of meeting it was. It's very bipartisan in nature. To my right was Trey Gowdy, Republican from South Carolina, who's on the judiciary, who's emerged as a good friend, notwithstanding what's happening with the Benghazi situation. To my left was Rand Paul. Not really to my left, but he was seated to my left. That was the type of room it was, talking about front-end reform in terms of sentencing, as well as back-end reform, reentry and rehabilitation. John Conyers, who's been in the Congress for 50 years, in fact, John Conyers is the only member of the House, the only member in the country who was endorsed both by Barack Obama and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I thought it was something like I had Koch's endorsement. John Conyers said that in his 50 years in the House, he had never been in a meeting such as that on such an important issue. And I can only hope that given the robustness of the ideological diversity, people from the House, people from the Senate, Democrats, Republicans, progressives, and conservatives, all of whom were there to discuss criminal justice reform, with the president, who's done a tremendous job in leading this conversation forward, that we will do what we essentially are elected to do, notwithstanding the public pressures that may exist and the economic anxiety, that on this criminal justice reform issue, as part of the effort to perfect our union, we can recognize that mass incarceration has been bad for individuals, families, and for the country. And we need to seize this opportunity to put an end to it once and for all.
Let me just say that I probably wasn't alone in expecting you to say, after you mentioned Trey County, that to your left was Jay-Z and Beyonce. Hakeem, we really appreciate your being here to talk with us about these issues tonight. You are, as long as I've known you, a man of principle and a great leader, and you've worked on them for a long time, I think before they came into this big right-left alignment, and I certainly hope that the progress that we make affords you an opportunity to keep leading on these issues and to move away from sort of the reactive policies that have really, I think, symbolized much of what has happened over the past few decades, because Lord knows we have decades of work ahead of us. So good luck over the next few months, and thank you very much for joining us.